Hi there. This chapter is somewhat troubling. It got me upset. Following an election that was highly dubious and was resolved only after the Supreme Court decided that a recount ordered by the Florida Supreme Court would violate the Equal Protection Clause. On January 20, 2001, George W. Bush took office. Less than 2 weeks later, Bush had a meeting in which, according to Lesley Stahl of 60 Minutes, among others, Dick Cheney and Paul ONeill, then the Treasury Secretary, participated. Lesley Stahl interviewed former Treasury Secretary Paul ONeill after a book was published by Simon Schuster entitled The Price of Loyalty.
He says that going after Saddam Hussein was topic A 10 days after the inauguration, 8 months before September 11th.
The author Ron Suskind's claim was that from day one, the Iraq war was late and sealed.
From the very first instance, it was about Iraq, it was about what we can do to change this regime.
Now, everybody else thought that grew out of 9/11.
No.
But this book says it was day one of this administration.
Day one, these things were laid and sealed.
The main source for this book was in fact Paul ONeill.
From the very beginning, there was a conviction that Saddam Hussein was a bad person and that he needed to go.
According to Ron Suskind, there are memos that even describe plans for a post-Iraq war period.
There are memos. One of them, marked secret, says, plan for post-Saddam Iraq.
Nation building.
Absolutely.
So they discussed an occupation of Iraq
in January and February of 2001.
It was not until 8 months later that an event happened that changed our lives, 9/11.
2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center.
That's incredible.
In an apparent terrorist attack on our
God.
country.
Oh, the next building
There's
just
another
blew
one.
up. Oh my God. Oh my God.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward.
The attack was followed by our invasion of Afghanistan. It also revived Bush and Cheneys Iraq vision. The problem was how to sell it to the people and, maybe even more important, to Congress. The answer came after Dick Cheney visited the CIA offices 8 times in 2 weeks, cherry-picking appropriate information. Weapons of mass destruction and Al-Qaeda links.
There is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt that he is amassing them to use against our friends, against our allies, and against us.
Not to be outdone by Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld even knew where they could be found.
We know where they are. They're in the area around Tikrit and Baghdad and east, west, south, and north somewhat.
Bush claimed Saddam had ties to a terrorist and could provide them with weapons.
Saddam Hussein aids and protects terrorists, including members of Al-Qaeda. Secretly and without fingerprints, he could provide one of his hidden weapons to terrorists or help them develop their own.
Finally, the ingenious blitz of a speechwriter, who, by the way, was later hired by the Washington Post, Mushroom Klaus.
A nuclear weapon in less than a year. Facing clear evidence of peril, we cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun, that could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
That did it. Congress approved the use of armed forces against Iraq. It did so despite the fact that French President Jacques Chirac and Germany's Chancellor Gerhard Schröder spoke out strongly against the war on Iraq, suggesting that it may achieve just the opposite effect, a strengthening of Al-Qaeda. Bush's mind was made up. Of course, there were no weapons of mass destruction, no chemical warfare weapons, and no connection between Saddam and Al-Qaeda. Indeed, the September 11 panel said in a report that it had found no collaborative relationship between Iraq and Al-Qaeda, something George W. now readily admits. Moreover, now the story changed. Actually, it changed so often that it is difficult to keep track. Now we went into Iraq to eliminate a breeding ground for terrorists.
Nobody's ever suggested that the attacks of September the 11th were ordered by Iraq. I have suggested, however, that resentment and the lack of hope create the breeding grounds for terrorists who are willing to use suiciders to kill to achieve an objective. I have made that case.
Oh yes, and the world is much better off without Saddam Hussein.
I firmly believe the world is better off without Saddam in power, Martha.
Coming to think of, off the top of my head, I could make a whole list of leaders the world would be better off without, if you get my drift. Cheney, as of today, didn't get it.
Hundreds of Americans say it's not worth fighting.
So?
So? You don't care what the American people think?
No, I think you cannot be blown off course.
Now, I may be dense, but I myself didn't quite get it. Why exactly did we invade Iraq? Democratize the Middle East? Good Lord, that will never happen. Even Rachel Maddow of MSNBC asked the question.
There were no weapons of mass destruction, and we were not greeted as liberators. Saddam Hussein was not connected to the 9/11 attacks, and there isn't greater stability in the Middle East. Maybe the Iraq War was just about oil?
No, that's an idea. It simply increased the value of crude. As bin Laden demanded, beyond $100 a barrel. And don't for one split second think that we will not be back to that level, give or take 6, maybe 10 months. Now, what is Rachel so jubilant about?
Speech. You know, 1972 is also the year that Iraq kicked out the foreign oil companies. That's when they nationalized their oil industry. And thus it is a weird numerological coincidence that yesterday was the day that for the first time since 1972, a Western oil company opened up an office in Iraq.
Now that makes sense. The Bush family being shareholders of big oil, Cheney having connection to Halliburton. Boy, it all falls into place, doesn't it? See you soon. Have a fantastic Sunday.